What's going on, Workforce? Brian here.
Chris here.
And today we've got a discussion topic that really has been brewing in our minds for a while. He's been just talking about it every time that we get together, and he's just like, let's talk about player agency. And we recently just had My Name is Bife on the podcast, and he brought up a really beautiful story talking about his love for Mass Effect and having that impact and how that played forward story to story. And so we thought we'd sit down today and hash out just our thoughts on player agency. And if you don't know what player agency is, Chris, why don't you tell them what it is?
So player agency in a nutshell is a player's ability to permanently and substantially affect the game. So if there's a fork in the story road and you pick left over right, what difference does that make? And so in a lot of games, there's very little player agency. So no matter which fork you choose, you end up in the same place, as opposed to open sandbox games where it's like something like Minecraft, where every decision you make makes your world even more unique to you. And you can see how, because those are two very different examples, some genres lend themselves to more agency than others.
So the last time we talked on this specific thing is we were talking about how it also relates to like Final Fantasy XIV versus older games. Because it feels, at least there's the perception that I share, but like I'll try to run maybe a counterpoint to some ideas here. We'll see how this plays out. But it feels like within 14, obviously you just accept one thing or another. 14 being a multiplayer MMO, but also within how you build your character. Every red mage is a red mage. Every ninja is a ninja. But in the older games, like you talk about sandboxes of Minecraft, I even look at Final Fantasy XI as a really good example of where they had player agency. I would say there's some really deep questions. I want you to dive in real quick because I could defeat my own point really fast.
I think that the stark contrast right now is you'd have to take the two most popular MMOs on the market. So you'd have to take Final Fantasy XIV, which Shadowbringers is considered the pinnacle of 14, and then WoW Classic, which for many WoW players is like, thank God, finally a WoW I want to play, because they're not happy with retail and they want that Classic experience. And Classic is so much more agency in that, like, when I played through Classic the first time, I don't remember having big, long discussions about the various bosses and what they mean. But I do remember having time where we would sit around and tell stories about that time that we attacked Terran Mill, or that time that we all raided a capital city, or that time that, Murlocs kept coming at us and we somehow lived, or maybe we didn't. And whatever just makes a good story there. And it's something we made. It's a unique experience to us, and we created that, as opposed to Final Fantasy, where Shadowbringers, whether you like the story, you don't like the story, whether you wish that you had different choices, there were some choices in some spots. Ultimately, going into patch 5.1, we are all in an identical place. We are all caught up. Everybody who's finished the story has the very same main characters, have made all the same choices. If somebody's died, they've died. If they've lived, they've lived. And that is flat. And I think that there's a strength in both, but whenever you have too much of one, you tend to want more of the other. So I think my issue, and what I was bringing up to Brian, was that I feel like games have moved less and less from being hybrids to more and more you're either in one or the other. So you have something like Ark Survival, Minecraft, Atlas, where it's all player agency. Then you have like Final Fantasy, BFA, where there's very little player agency. And how come we don't have those in-betweens anymore? Why is that not viable at a AAA level?
I have a question on that, because as a non-BFA player and as somebody who looks at 11 and 14 in two different ways, and they each bring their strengths, is BFA more narrative driven?
Yes. So you literally have a war campaign now. So that's the closest comparison to that would be your MSQ quest.
Okay.
You have to unlock it to get to certain things. Each zone on your home island is its own contained capsule story, so those can be enjoyed in any order.
Okay.
But then you start to go off to the other island, and that's where they've kind of tested out this war campaign concept. And that's a story they're telling. And as you go through the raids and things like that, that's them expanding on that story. But the raid always ends in victory, right? So the raid always ends in whatever boss is at the end of that has to die or retreat or whatever the story may tell you. But no matter how you play that raid, you can never side with that boss, right? You're always killing them in an MMO.
Isn't that then essentially, like, from an agency perspective where we have control, isn't that just, you could really call this sandbox versus theme park, or sandbox versus, a movie, so to speak. It's where when we go to a movie together, like, we might have a different experience emotionally, but we've seen the same story. Right. And in a multiplayer game, because I think this is different. Like, you look at like games like Mass Effect, where you have this major effect, is that from a development perspective, it's easy for developers to say, okay, if they could pick A, B, C, even if they brought in 100 different choices, they're fully in control. As opposed to, like, if you ran up and I'm like talking to this guy and you just like chop off his head, you're like, I had to kill him because I was on this other quest, but now I can't finish my quest. Ultimately, we've affected each other's world, and maybe I couldn't progress there. And ultimately, from a game perspective, the developers aren't able to control that level of stuff. So I think from a pure design perspective, we're really arguing sandbox versus that theme park, that curated, like, there's a lot of attractions, but you have a curated experience versus here's the tools that the game offers. Go nuts, have fun, and create your own stories around the lore, and we're going to give you, like, we're going to set you up with a book, and then you're just going to go nuts. And so is that what we're ultimately arguing? Because I know a lot of people come and say player agency, especially when you build out just like a character beyond the narrative, is just an illusion, because there is going to ultimately be one correct choice.
I think you're hitting on, so the first point that I think you touch on is that it does run shockingly parallel with single player versus multiplayer, in that it's not that single player has to have agency, but multiplayer seems to remove you from it, because they have to write all the forks. And so when you kind of do like Black Mirror Bandersnatch or something, and you look at fork, even if it's always left or right, there's never a multiple choice, like 4 answer question. It still becomes 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and the number of personality, like, and so you look at games where, I wish I could play every game that I take interest in, but one game I took interest in, I watched some Let's Plays of, and I watched some reviews of, namely Skill Ups is of course wonderful. So if Skill Up has a review on a game, always watch it. And is Greedfall. And he talks about how there's different ways to finish a quest, a lot like a Hitman game, where there's different ways to kind of complete the objective, which is agency. You're choosing how we get there.
So putting narrative to the side and just talking about how you approach a situation.
How you approach it. But he complained that then you have this beautiful world and you run too far off to the left and you run into an invisible wall. Like you said, it's a question of dev time, and that's where the illusion gets broken. Up until then, you felt like it was your world to explore, and they're like, there's an invisible wall past this tree. You can't keep going because we ran out of stuff we built. So
ultimately, then, how much dev time? Because when you take it from a single player to a multiplayer, it's a multiplication in development. It just okay. It's not add in. Don't check a multiplayer box that doesn't exist. So how much time should these devs spend on these things that potentially nobody ends up seeing, right? Because let's say you gave every quest just the left and the right option, and then how many quests are in Final Fantasy XIV right now? People complain about the 500 of just ARR. If you gave everything kind of an A and B, A and B, A and B, like, you could be compounding and compounding, not just narratively, but just, okay, you approached it this way. Where I feel that player agency would have the value is that if in that 500 quest, all of a sudden it's like, hey, yeah, like, remember when you like totally decided to massacre those people? We still remember that, as opposed to like that had no consequence whatsoever. You got your experience and your reward, and thus it's meaningless or feels empty. Right?
You killed the grandfather, so now the guard's hair color changes because there's a different guard. Like, at the very least, some little hints that it's like, no, you've altered history here, even though there still is a guard on duty. That guard looks different because you murdered that other family. And so there is an interest there. I think when asking how much dev time, it has a lot to do with what the purpose of your game is. The purpose of Final Fantasy is to tell a story, almost to the point that it's a single player MMO. And the goal of something like Minecraft is to just open up possibilities, and that's why you see like the mod community thrive so much, because it's just, if there's somebody idea out there, somebody's found a way to get it in game, and then there's whole mod packs that just blow up the number of possibilities beyond the already infinite number. And where you see it fail, where you see somebody say there's no reason to develop stuff that people won't see, is in something like No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky is incredibly procedurally generated. There's an infinite number of worlds, but just because it feels infinite doesn't mean it is infinite, because there weren't enough things at launch. Now they've gone back and they've supported a lot of those things, but the initial serving, the initial first impression that a huge number of gamers will stop at and never re-explore that title, stopped at, the 5th planet, the 12th planet, the 30th planet, they all started to look alike. And that was because there wasn't those little Easter eggs that you would expect if it really was. But that requires, you have to develop 10,000 things so that you know that the 100 things the player will actually find are different than the 100 things their friend finds.
Okay. So I'm going to shift the focus here, kind of bringing it into like Final Fantasy, because you talk sure. the loss of hybrid, essentially, where you have that theme park and that sandbox, bringing it together, and beyond the narrative and how you approach the game and kind of your journey through it. There's also the concept of building out your character in unique ways. Now, earlier I alluded to Final Fantasy XI, in which you had the sub-job system. Really, where the illusion argument comes in is that, like, okay, if you play a dancer, you want a sub-job X or ninja or something because you're going to get these traits and these bonuses. So there really is no choice. There really is no agency once a meta is established. However, you still have the freedom, and sometimes I've always said is that if the game doesn't do a good job, it gives you the freedom to make mistakes as opposed to pick the right path, depending on if you're service in the meta. But within 14, we've seen that completely go away over the course of its life, from ARR, even from 1.0, but ARR to now, where before you had to pick and choose various skills, and we even made a video on it because we're frustrated about it, like when Stormblood did it, where they're like, here, have all the skills. Just have all the skills. They're yours. Just stop bugging us about it, because people would macro, and ultimately it was just this nuisance. And when they added them back, my controllers just went to crap, because it was like, there's too many skills. If you can take them all, really the answer is to take them all. There will be a preference, but over the course of ARR, there was just skills that they had that had no value. They had no, like, it was like, might as well, like, kick yourself in the shin if you take this skill, because it literally is doing nothing for you. Right. So, it's like, there's a dev issue there, but in the end, like, agency from a character spec and a character building, as much as we want it, doesn't that ultimately affect us? And what do you think a good solution would be?
I think it affects my attention span personally. I can only speak to my experience. So while Shadowbringers has been my favorite Final Fantasy experience so far, of almost any Final Fantasy game, it's up there with like Final Fantasy X. It's by far my favorite 14 experience. It's an incredible story, but then I don't feel like it's my story. So it's been easier to take breaks. It's been easier to focus on other games because there's less agency now than ever before. At this point, we already don't have like factions or racial quests, so we already don't engage in something like I mentioned BFA. Well, there's a very different experience for Alliance than there is for Horde, and in some expansions more than others. There's nothing like that here. There isn't. Lalafels don't have a shockingly different experience, especially once you get past level 15. Those initial starting cities, even, that's gone. So current in-game really doesn't care about what race you are, doesn't care about what gender you are, and honestly, with the kind of simplification, it doesn't even care as much what job you are, because the jobs now share in that. All my tanks shared one series of lore plus expansion, as opposed to exploring what is it to be a warrior versus a Dark Knight. It's like, no, you played through the role quests one time and that covered your bases. Now it gave them a chance to go so much more in depth.
Yeah,
I engaged more in that tank role quest than I would have individually in the warrior quest or the paladin quest or the Dark Knight. I just don't know that losing all of those to get this one thing, I don't know if that's worth it. Yes or no. I literally don't know.
Right. See, and that's the thing that hopefully that if you guys are still watching this video, let us know in the comments below what you guys feel regarding the worth it. Because here's where I feel about it, is that there is so much good that has come out of it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, okay, I can jump in, I can use matchmaking, I can play the game, I can trust that even if you don't know your rotation or the skills, depending on the type of player you are, you have those skills. You have, like, why don't you have this, this one ability? You need this one ability for us to be able to do this very effectively, right? So it kind of removes some of that stress, because with agency and with choice you have stress. The counterpoint that 14 is doing, which is interesting when we talk about hybrids and they're not fully complete, But in 5.1, Blue Mage is getting an expansion as a part of its level cap, more skills. That is player agency and choice completely. Like, oh, you want to take these abilities? Great. We're going to build different fights that are going to be tailored to that. Ultimately, I fall under the thing that where you have convenience and then you have what we want. And ultimately, Yoshi P and the dev team are trying to build that sandwich that is satisfying for a wide variety of players for a wide variety of reasons. And their biggest limitation is dev time and dev resources, because people aren't satisfied that Blue Mage can't do raid content. Well, they'd have to have redesigned it. But there is a sense that it brings into kind of an open world, kind of questing. It brings in some of these things. And if it was at level, like if they had more time, it would be nice if we could play around with it more. Eureka's another example of that sandboxy element in which that you have these different objectives that you can go out and fulfill. And, it's dead content now. So ultimately, it is this, 14 has tried to bring these kind of things in and tried to kind of stitch in some level of, sandbox into their game design. And it works and it doesn't. It's like it is successful or not. And so where your original, kind of question or, that you brought up when we were just talking about this a little while ago was like, why does it feel like the older games have more of it? And I would say, and I've said this numerous times, and it's against my own self-interest, it's matchmaking. It's that when we are trying to funnel people into this content quickly, we have to start to remove the things that are going to cause stress or cause toxicity or cause frustration with one another. Like if you and I rolled the dice and got matched together and your Blue Mage has the one skill, wait a minute, what the heck? And now you're hurting my time and impacting me, as opposed to if we got together and said, hey, here's what's agreed upon. And you said, hey, I only have the one skill. We could say, go get some skills, go out and do this thing. And then you can come join us. But the negative there is that keeps that limits your population for your availability to people who only have the time to commit to do those kind of grinds. And so I think it is both good, and it's also kind of like the poisonous dagger, because we're also like, people feel like they're unsatisfied with some of these newer modern MMOs. And that's why I think Classic was such a big hit, because it does offer something that people have been craving, but it's not the vast majority of people. I think that as we've seen games and populations grow, we've seen them try to find that new common denominator, right? I think it's all just a mathematical equation. Thoughts? You
I think that so I don't think it's just that, because just that the counterpoint would be games that still allow a lot of agency within builds, specifically within battle class. So I would look at games like Monster Hunter World or Diablo style games that allow you to have a decent amount of flexibility. Now Diablo 3 has substantially less flexibility than past Diablos, but for the purpose of this conversation, I wish I was an expert on Path of Exile. So I know that there's still games out there that allow that kind of build. They just then, of course, have to limit you to like a common objective. So like in Fortnite, for example, everybody's trying to kill each other. And so no matter if somebody's good with a gun or bad with a gun, if there were different builds, look at like Apex, where there are different characters and stuff, you can start to allow choice to matter less, because the objective is so simple that balance kind of levels itself out. Obviously, the more complex the objective, the more you have to kind of streamline. So when you look at something like Final Fantasy, where the goal is to get people into 8-man content and kill this boss with all these mechanics, all of a sudden you have to really make all the tanks similar, because the objective is so complex versus simply killing people in Halo. Like that's it. As long as it kills, and so it's fairly easy. I would think that factor on its own is a factor, but what about people's need for like visual or narrative fidelity? Like that, we expect so much better of a story, and we expect so much better visuals than ever before.
Well, voice acting, just the cost of voice acting and the narrative, the scripting, the animation. Like there are these things that have come in that are well received, and so it's essentially where like the thought, like what you were talking that I was having, was just tied into that, like within 14 specifically.
Right.
The agency isn't necessarily the red mage or the black mage or the summoner. It's the way that those jobs play. So like, yeah, tanks are more normalized together, but they all kind of play a different way. So you would have somebody who wants a high technical play style. You would have somebody who wants a little bit easier of a rotation. And so that the difference comes into like, well, yeah, that all the tanks can tank. Well, how do you prefer to play? Do you like a lot of actions? Do you like a lot of things coming at you? Do you like a little bit more simplified, approach? And so hopefully trying to get that player agency and choice coming into what's the play style you prefer, as opposed to you can build a warrior one of three ways. Oh, right. You didn't build it the way that this fight requires, then we have to go and figure it out.
I mean, the gearing and the rotations are still relatively flat in current 14. You kind of dealt what you're dealt. But things like Eureka are substantially...
Oh, yeah.
Now, in trade for that, you give up... I mean, we constantly in the North American market, people ask why more things aren't voice acted. And that has a lot to do with it's already very hard to get the amount they do have voice acted. They definitely don't want to have 12 versions of the story to go get voice. We'd lose all voice acting.
We'd have to sacrifice that. Yeah.
The people who wrote the story and the people who wrote the music and stuff, if you started to spin up different versions of the zones where there might be a different musical score, you might have to have multiple writers and multiple music people instead of where we got to get what they feel the best person was, because not all writers are going to do an equally good job with the story they're given. And it's like, well, Brian, we need somebody to write the burned down version of the beautiful purple forest. And sorry if you're not into that, but that's what we need you to write. And so then your product, of course, is not nearly as good as somebody who got to write, like, oh my gosh, Ilmeg just speaks to me. I've been dreaming of it. And so there's just this incredible lore that they infuse into their version of the zone. So I think, yes, there's a fair bit of agency when you look at things like relic grinds, secondary systems, so like Blue Mage, Chocobo Racing, where you kind of get to build your version within the confines of that system, but in the main serving of the game, right? You're just going through the game. You look at it from like the big zoomed out, I've got 8 people. Those 8 people being all pushed through MSQ and then doing all their trials and dungeons together have a fairly straightforward experience. Like you said in the movie, they may all emotionally connect to it differently, but they all heard the same lines at the same pacing for the same total runtime.
Yeah.
And I think we've been given an incredible game as a result. Naturally, as humans, we want more. And so, like, what I now crave is, like, without losing anything we got in Shadowbringers, how could I have more of an effect on the world? How could I feel like I really impacted the first, not as a warrior of light, but as Chris, as Brian, as this warrior of light, not as one of however many active players there are,
My final thought on it, though, is that you kind of touch on it, is that there's no real, like, faction. We have the grand companies, and we've got the free companies, we've got our city-states, and it's there. Like, so it technically could be there, but it just doesn't have the highest level of impact. So and this is my final thought, because it also can come down to the data center. People say, like, Crystal, for example, big role-playing data center, not necessarily as big into the raiding scene, in which that a lot of the balance and a lot of the focus is on. And that's, everybody can have their own, they can have their own agency and how that they value their time in the game. But at a kind of a final thought is that they can go and they can play with those roles. They can have their own inner squabbles. They can build that role play aspect. And that is a sandbox element. That is an agency element in which that they can kind of meld with the tools in it. It would be just cool if the game also had an element to drive more people into being pro Adder or pro, Mortal Flames or pro Maelstrom, if there was some kind of conflict, because ultimately that is a gameplay element that would, every week when you log in, oh my gosh, Maelstrom has taken over the entire Thanalan for whatever reason, like that's obviously like that wouldn't fit the lore and the narrative of the story. So some of that all comes into play, and so that's where when you look at like Classic, you have the Horde and Alliance, and they can, you can press forward, so you could end up having players choosing to make that and having that experience of whether you win or lose in this certain battle, and thus it kind of goes back and forth. You got any final thoughts?
No, I mean, it's an interesting topic. I would love to hear from in the comments, like what people think. I do want to make it clear, like, I'm not bashing Shadowbringers. I love Shadowbringers, and I cannot wait for 5.1. I'm simply just opening up a question about, like, is there something different that would be even better, or is this the best that it can be, and the game can never get better than this? It needs to just be repeats of the existing content forever and ever. And I think it's a hard thing to fathom, and of course we're just calling for infinite dev time and infinite dev budget and I understand there's limits to that, but as a player, like, it isn't our job to think about the limits. It's our job to ask for what we want and ask for it clear enough that they can then go say, okay, within their limits, which they know, what can I give you of what you asked for?
Right. And then how does it not step on the things that you love, and that we're like, what happened to the dungeons? We're like, well,
and they have, like parents, they have to know what I'm really saying, not what I'm saying, because your kid asks for ice cream every day, but you know that if I only give them ice cream 3 meals a day, they're going to have a stomach ache. And so you have to know, okay, like, you're asking for this, but I still have to take care of your basic needs, and I still have to keep you from getting yourself in trouble, getting everything you ask for.
So anyway, like Chris said, let us know your thoughts below. These are just our opinions. These are our perspective. Did we miss a point? Did we hit a point on too hard? Or what would you like to see, whether it's with Final Fantasy XIV or like an amazing single player experience, that those games still exist. Those games are still coming out, and you can have those experiences as well. I guess, we really kind of want the best of both worlds. Like, we want our single player experience, but meshed in a beautiful world in which that, like, my experience can impact your experience. So we'll have,
but only in a good way.
But only in a good way. And then also make it quick and fast so that I can get in and I can go about with my life, etc.
But not lazy or casual.
No, not at all. Anyway, from Work the Game, my name's Brian.
My name's Chris.
Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you have a great day.
Take care.